I will start out. So we're going to talk about exchange sacrifices in the French defense today. And this is the plan. So since this is complex middle games, I'm thinking about doing opening lines that goes into the early middle game and then take middle game positions. So I like to differ between early middle game and middle game. The early middle game being the transition from the opening into the middle game. So in the early middle game, you still have much of the knowledge from the opening that can give you some ideas what to do in the early middle game. So you can form the plans. You can still prepare that part of the middle game where you have the typical plans of the openings. So and looking at specific opening lines in the French defense is actually very helpful to try to get our first idea of these exchange sacrifices, how they start out, how they come about. So there are some patterns that we will see here. So in general, I think that's exactly why opening theory is a good thing to study if you do it the right way. Because this is kind of like perfect play. People have played it before. It has been justified. That's why it's, if you take the main line, it is the main line for a reason. And so the opening is the first and easy way to see exchange sacrifice in the French, for instance. They happen in a line and you kind of know it must be correct. And then you start to wonder, and that's the first time you experience that knowledge. And then later when we go to the middle games, we might understand it better because we were able to study the opening on our own. So, so these are the two parts. That's how I'm going to do it. And the puzzle part is mainly positions from the middle game. So, and there are, in the puzzles, most of the positions are black to move. So I'm a little bit biased there. But the reason is also another one is, and that's the attraction for black to play the French defense. I used to play the French defense for many years, is that the exchange sacrifices, they are more strategic in nature. So black is trying to keep the position fairly closed, and then you sacrifice the exchange for long-term compensation, usually, not always, but usually. Whereas your typical, when it happens for white in the French, it's usually to use a development advantage or take the initiative, stuff like that. So it's more like a dynamic advantage when white plays it. So as I said, this is just a rule of thumb, but it seems to happen this way. And I can say for myself that one of the reasons I was attracted to the French, I'm still attracted to it, is that these strategic exchange sacrifices, they, I find them very appealing. Okay, so a couple of things to consider when we sacrifice an exchange. So it's always a good idea to have an additional rook when you sacrifice an exchange. It's not always possible, and it doesn't always matter. But in the majority of cases, you have two rooks. You sacrifice one rook on a minor piece. And then after you sacrifice the exchange, you still have the rook to try to coordinate your minor pieces. And the rook is actually very good at that. So we will see different examples of this. So yeah, there are also positions where if you are pawn up and you then sacrifice an exchange, then you have this dynamic balance, which minor piece and pawn is often equivalent to a rook, even though in points the rook side is better. But minor piece and pawn, and maybe you add 1-2 other factors, like you have a slight initiative, you have an active position, you have few weaknesses, then it usually adds up to about the same. One interesting thing here is that the computers, they don't always see that. They can give the rook side an advantage from 0 to 0.5 5, which is half a pawn. So there's a good rule of thumb that says everything up to half a pawn is don't listen to the computer, use your own thinking. So it happens a lot that you have advantages for the rook side that is say 0.40, but in reality it's just compensation, because the plans the engine comes up with, for instance, are not very concrete. So it's basically based on the material value of 5 versus 4, let's say, minus a few positional factors, and then you end up with half a pawn. But if you look at the computer and it doesn't actually show a concrete line to show the advantage, then you know maybe there is compensation. So we will see cases of this. So let's get started. We'll unshare for a moment and get to a position. So 3 opening lines. Let's see how many we do. But the first one here is in the terrace French, and it is the main line. So so white is always trying to keep this structure in the French usually, and then black breaks here later. So that's very typical. So knight e2. And we get to this position. And here basically black wants to line up queen and bishop here. And black doesn't really want white to be able to play bishop f4, because it's in white's interest to exchange the dark squared bishops. As we talked about in the first class of this program, in the French, we typically have these 2 bishops as the double-edged bishops. So white will try to isolate bishop c8, and black will try to isolate bishop c1. And because of the dark squares and what is called the bad French bishop on c8, then it's white who wants to exchange the dark squared bishops in general. So a lot of the theory is based upon that, which makes it easier to remember. So there's a very clear strategic idea for white to try to exchange those bishops. So let's see. So black has 2 ways to develop. It's either queen c7 or bishop d6. So for a start, we will just skip over this part of white trying to play bishop f4, and we'll go straight to the main line where white castles. And now bishop g5. And white's idea is simply to get back here to exchange the 2 dark square bishops. So since we couldn't go to f4, we're going this way instead. Okay, black castles, bishop h4. And now knight h5 is that idea. Simply keep this bishop on d6. So queen c2 attacks this pawn, and black plays h6. And now white gives a check first. It's kind of an important check here on h7 before white plays bishop g6. The idea is very logical. Get rid of that knight so we again can play bishop g3 and exchange those dark square bishops. So everything evolves around that. Let's see. And then black sacrifices the exchange on f3. So we're still deep into opening theory, but we are of course going to analyze some of the resulting positions from this. So white basically has 2 options here. White can take that rook, accept the challenge, or white can simply take this knight out and then still hope for this idea of playing bishop g3. So let's see, bishop takes h5 first. take that pawn. And then we go back to f5. Now this bishop on h5 is attacked. Bishop g6. And here we have a position where we can go back with the bishop and then sacrifice the exchange like this. And let me show you this position. Let's imagine this king was on g8. Let's say white did not give that check on h7 before going back to g6, then the king would have been on g8. If that were the case, then this strong idea for white would not work. Rook e1. So the idea is after queen f7, now black is threatening queen h5, pinning that bishop. Bishop goes back to g3. And now f4 would normally be a strong move. But in this position, white can play knight takes f4 because this is leading to checkmate. So if that king was on g8, then black could simply go to f7 with a fine position. d4 is hanging, and black is doing fine here. And white cannot keep the rook on the back rank, trying to block the black development. So this is great for black. If the king was on g8, now it's leading to checkmate. So that's a great idea. So let's see the version for white of this. So let's say white plays bishop g6, which is the worst move. And then let's say white goes ahead like this. And we get to the same position, but with the king on g8. And now this, again, this doesn't work because f4, now it works for black. So instead of rook e1, white could go f4. And then queen f7, typical maneuver. So the idea is black wants to go bishop d7, but we want the queen on the other side. And also we want to get out of this pin on the c file. So queen f7 makes a lot of sense. We're also defending d5. So that's a lot of good things about queen h5. Now king g1 to get out of that pin, bishop d7, and rook ae1. So let's see about this position just for a moment. So the typical compensation here for black is that, okay, d4 is weak. It happens a lot. White maybe have a slightly exposed king. To black's advantage, the position is fairly closed, and we still have a lot of pieces on the board. And let's see, yeah, so this bishop on h4 is maybe not so well placed after white had to play f4, and the bishop is a little bit behind the own pawns. It's not so mobile, and there are some light squared weaknesses that black might be able to use, maybe to get the knight around or get the rook in. So amazingly enough, black can actually play rook e8 here. So black has already sacrificed one exchange and has remained with the rook. And the idea of going to e8 is, of course, not to exchange a rook. Black would like to keep that extra rook because he's an exchange down. But in this position, black can actually play rook e4. And so this is actually the second exchange we are sacrificing. So this has never been played before, but it's a very good idea, and the engine confirms it. If white takes, well, if white doesn't take, then d4 is just hanging, or f4. And now black has all kinds of ideas of activity. We have also a passed pawn on e4. The position is fairly closed, so it's not clear what white rooks are doing right now. Well, you could try to push that f pawn, but right now d4 is hanging. It's just difficult for white to activate those rooks. Black doesn't really have a lot of weaknesses to take care of. There's b7, there's d5. So all these factors count for black. So here's a line. One move is queen d1 to try to defend against queen h5, protect d4, maybe try to get g4 going, and then f5 maybe. And then here's one possible move. Let's say white plays actively like this, and we just grab a pawn and play b5. So black is able to keep this position fairly closed. So the white rooks are still not into the game really. So so black is doing fine here. That was just one example. Another idea is maybe perhaps just to play queen h5 and then stop all white play, because it seems like the only play white really has is pushing that f pawn. And two exchanges down, but even though, let's see this endgame after g4. Well, d5 is kind of a weakness, but it's very hard to get to now. Seems like this double-edged bishop has really been isolated now. It's not really doing a lot. And the rooks are no open files for those rooks. So white can, of course, try something like this. But an endgame like this is pretty good for black. So these are just typical ideas. When black sacrifices an exchange, the position is not so open, so white's rooks are not so active. At the moment, we are still in the early middle game. Rooks tend to get stronger as the game goes on. But these exchange sacrifices usually happen in the early part of the middle game, or maybe the position remains close for a long time. So that is the strategic considerations black have for sacrificing the exchange. So, and if white doesn't play, white could play something like a3, but bishop to b6, targeting this weakness. Black has a stable position. We could even consider maybe playing h5 at some point just to stop g4. But I don't think there's any need for it. So black just has an active and solid position. Definitely compensation. So the engine has a lot of 0.00 lines here, and basically because it thinks that black should look for a perpetual, being 2 exchanges down. So, but that doesn't really tell you anything about the position. That's just how the chess engines think. At least the chess engines before AlphaZero, because AlphaZero doesn't make that mistake. But that's another story for a later class. So let's go back a little bit. So rook e8, rook e4 was a pretty amazing idea. So let's try to go back. So now we have our ideas. So let's say white plays the better move and goes back into this main line. Let's see, bishop takes. We get back to this, and here rook e1 was a strong move because we're ready to sacrifice on f4. And now f4 is no good. But here, and this is a new idea. It's I just thought, why not play something like bishop b4, avoiding the exchange, and then we're attacking this rook on e1. So let's follow this line a little bit. And this is one of these lines where the computer says 0.40, 0.50 to white, but without, when you start to play out the lines, it looks pretty okay for black. So let's see. rook d1, bishop d7, which is developing, a3, bishop a5. So if white keeps going b4, then the bishop drops back to either b6 or c7, no, b6, and then trying to target the d4 pawn. So let's say for white is trying to resolve this issue of trying to get the knight into the game, which is not so easy. If knight f4, then g5 is suddenly an option, followed by f4. So one idea that comes to mind is to try to play bishop e5, and then follow up by knight f4, and then try to get the minor pieces to occupy the center. So that makes a lot of sense. So that's what I tried. And then it turns out that black has a strong move here, f4. Because of white's coordination isn't so great. If knight takes, then we can take the bishop and then take the knight here. So that's a bad idea. There's no fork with rook d5. We always have bishop f5. So that doesn't work. And then if bishop takes here, we have all kinds of active play with our pieces here. Check, and then this knight is hanging, and white can try to get some counterplay going like this, but basically black wins a piece here, and white is trying to show some compensation. So f4 here is a pretty good idea, and it just shows you how active the position is, and black doesn't have to worry too much about defense here, because yeah, his weaknesses are hard to get at. So a lot of compensation for the exchange based on additional pieces. And there's also this idea of the slightly weak white king. So that's actually playable. So bishop b4 is a novelty. And as far as I can see, black gets a playable position. So even this line with the king in the corner on h8 is still playable for black. Okay, so let's look at some of the other lines after g takes f3. So this looks more like standard French positions, I would say. So let's say now black gets a pawn here. And everything is hanging for black, but black has this idea of knight f4. And if king takes the bishop, then, for instance, we can take that bishop here. We can also take the bishop is the. I'll probably take the knight, so we don't run into bishop g3. Something like this is pretty standard. It's good for black. So let's say knight takes. And let's say queen takes. You can also consider bishop take and then just bishop d7 to try to keep those pawns here doubled. But it seems like black usually often takes here on g3. So even though that undoubles the pawn, the white king is still slightly weak. But these are details. So let's say queen takes and then queen f6. So now this queen here on f6, now black is really targeting that pawn on d4. And this is your typical French compensation. So let's take another position where everything is not hanging right away. Bishop takes and then bishop d7. So the compensation here is, of course, there's an open white king, double pawn. White has some ideas to swing the rook over, but that's another story. So a lot of it is based on the central structure here. So this is very normal. We have this set up. But I would say for black is this unit of bishop, knight, and two pawns. And together with a pawn maybe, but the pawn usually stays on b7. But this makes sure that the central lines are staying closed. So there are no real open lines for the white rooks, at least not for now. D4 is a weakness. E6 not so much so because our double is bishops on D7. So it's defending that biggest weakness on E6. And the knight is just there keeping the C file closed, attacking D4. So this is one of the central setups for black in the French. And double-edged bishop, this is our goalkeeper. So black still has a lot of pieces to play with, and especially this additional rook can go to the F file. So beside E6, which is defended by the bishop, it's hard to really find weaknesses in black position, which gives black a lot of freedom to think about attacking options. So this is very interesting position. So that comes after rook takes F3. Let me see. Let's try to backtrack. This was the main line, and there are many details and nuances in the main line, but very interesting positions. So let's try to go back and discuss this difference between bishop d6 and queen c7, trying to get both those pieces on the long diagonal there. So let's see. Bishop d6. And let's say white plays bishop f4. And now queen a5 check is a little bit annoying for white. If white goes back with the bishop, then we go back to c7, and then we got what we want. So queen d2 is one of the leads to an endgame now, or black has other options, but queen takes d2 seems to be perfectly playable. Then take here and castle. So black has this pressure along the f file, and this knight on f4 is not protected. So one of the main line goes rook e1, and then knight e4. So white was threatening to take on e6, and knight e4, bishop takes, rook takes f4. Bishop drops back. And now this pawn on d4 is hanging. So let's say knight takes d4, then king e3, knight takes f3, king takes f4, knight takes e1, rook takes e1. And now after bishop d7, king e5, white has a lot of compensation for that pawn. The engine slightly prefers white here. It's, yeah, I wouldn't like playing this with black. Well, it's a little bit scary, that active white king, I think. So white definitely has compensation, and but that's another story. It's a line like this. So let's try to see if we can deviate from this line. So bishop d3, do we really have to take on d4? So let's see what's going on in the position. The reason why this is often played is that many players would think that white has this powerful strategical idea of playing bishop b5 and taking the knight, and then we just cement our knight on e5. So, but it turns out that, again, this is one of these positions where it's not only this knight versus this bishop. So that's one of the secrets behind the French defense. It's not only that, add one or two extra rooks, a few other pieces, and then suddenly a lot of things are going on in the position. So black can actually play bishop d7 here. And if bishop b5, we can simply play rook f8. So there are all kinds of the idea here with rook g4, because these pawns here are vulnerable. And yeah, this is actually leading to a black advantage. So again, we have our bishop here, which is our goalkeeper, just defending everything. And now suddenly the rooks are doing the attacking, where black will win back the pawn here and be very active. So this is slightly better for black. And if white doesn't do anything very active, then black might come up with this idea of, let's say, we have to defend against rook g4. I don't know, maybe rook e3. Yeah, maybe rook e3. Oh, d4 is also hanging. So there's a lot of pressure here. So, and so a black might also come up sometimes with this idea of simply taking this knight out. But right now it looks pretty good for black, so there's no need for it. But here's your typical French position again with this bishop and knight and this setup, and d4 is weak. So it's really interesting. So let's look at the other line briefly. Let's say queen c7 first. And then after bishop f4, we can play bishop b4. This is also a little bit annoying for white. Knight c3, of course not, then queen can take f4. What else? Bishop back, then bishop goes back to d6. That doesn't make sense for white. So king f1 is the main move. So white is going to great length here to exchange those bishops. Let's say bishop d6, and then g3 is the idea, to get the king to g2, and then pretend we castled. So white's argument is it's so important to exchange those bishops that he's ready to weaken his king side a little bit. And here, black actually has a good score here in this from this position. So one idea is to play e5 immediately. And then this is a totally different kind of French position where we're not sure if this isolated pawn d5 is strong or weak, but black is playing for activity. I think it makes sense after the king has, after g3, king g2, where the king can prove a slightly weaker on g2 than it would be on g1. So there's also the slow way of building up e5, just getting, let's say, rook c1 is pinning the queen. Then we do this first, something like this, and now we're ready for e5, maybe. So that was a slow way of doing it. So you see how all these strategies basically evolved around the dark squared bishops, and there's a lot of lines where we get into these exchange sacrifices. So very interesting stuff. So let's try to talk about another line in the French defense. Okay, so this is the classical setup for white with the knight on c3. And now your typical move here is f4, c5, knight f3. So white is not trying to keep a pawn on d4 here, but trying rather to play something like bishop e3, queen d2, and trying to stay with a piece on d4. So it's a different idea. But there is one line here in the French where white has the idea of keeping a pawn on d4. And this was played against me in one game, knight c to e2. So white is really wasting a lot of time in the opening, moving the knight around just to get the pawn to c3. And also get a pawn to f4, and then get to this position. And if you are playing the French defense, you need to know what to do against these positions, because if you don't find a good way to break up this very solid pawn structure in the center, then black can easily get to a point where it's hard to improve the position. So playing black side of the French defense, you really need to have a strategy to do that. So there are a lot of lines where black can sacrifice a knight to get rid of these two central pawns, but that's also very risky and doesn't always work. So this position is quite challenging for black. So white is kind of putting black to the test, I would say. I found some of these lines to be the most challenging in the French defense, because you really need to know what you're doing. Okay, so Yeah, and here is an idea, h4. It was played first in correspondence chess. And so the idea is basically white is saying, oh, I have a solid enough structure, so I don't need to develop my pieces. Rather, I will try to tempt black to sacrifice a piece, and then I can take it from there. But black often has this counterpunch with g5, just to try to break up everything. So that's one idea behind h4. And another idea is simply to push the pawn and try to utilize that rook down here on h1. So it's a pretty interesting idea. So, so white is simply not thinking about development here, which is of course also risky. And here I played a new plan at the time. It was found over the board, so it actually took me a lot of time on the clock because rook takes f3 is not your typical strategical exchange sacrifice, because this gets to a very complicated position. And then this check forces the king out, and then bishop f2. So I haven't won a pawn yet, but I'm putting a lot of pressure on d4, and this king is running around in the middle of the board. So I'm of course hoping to an f3 is weak, so I might be able to get around on the f file, and I can easily be ahead in development. White needs a lot of time to bring his king to safety, and so that was the idea. But there was a move like this. My opponent didn't play it, but after this move, I probably have to give up this pawn on e6, because it's too slow to. If I start to move my pieces away, then it's a little bit slow, and white can also take his time to defend d4. So here it's actually a very dynamic position and not only strategical. That was one reason why I spent a little bit of time. So here are some examples. I can take d4 here with either knight or the bishop. Let's say something like bishop takes, or we can say knight takes, something like this, and then bishop takes e6. And then white can move the king, for instance, and insert h6. I have to play g6. I don't want to open that h file for the rook. And then, so the computer, for instance, the chess engine was very happy about white's position, and it based it on this move, queen a4, because now it wins material with the idea of going to e8 with the queen. Let's say after knight e8, queen e8. Then I can take on e6 and sacrifice that exchange. So here's another double exchange sacrifice. And now I can even start attacking immediately. So f8 is hanging now, checkmate. So, or I could also play a move like king g8. And here, after a while, the computer drops its evaluation to 0.40. But so I'm not sure how many human players in this position with white. The king is running around in the center. White has no coordination between the pieces. Let's say our knight is just a defensive piece for now. Then we still have queen and two bishops trying to attack the white king. If the bishop moves, then b2 is hanging. So this only takes one half bad move for white, and then it's all over. So it's white is not playing like a computer here. So it's I wouldn't take this position with white any day. So I'd be happy to take it from the black side. So basically, in all these lines, I think black has compensation, but it's very complicated. So he didn't play this bishop h3. He actually just went for king c2. And I played queen b6. And after that, I think white was slightly better, but it ended up in a draw. I have added that game to the database. But queen f8 is actually a strong new move. just trying to get this way and also trying to attack f3. And in this position, I think black is better. So so again, we have a position where this bishop is just going to stay there for a while, and the rest of the black pieces can try to create a lot of. So we already have two weaknesses to attack here. So black's active play, white's lack of coordination, and the king here is, I think black has a great position. So, but this was not entirely a strategical decision. Rook takes f3. So that's why it took me a while. Let's look at another opening line. So here's knight d2, back to knight d2. And instead of playing the main line, starting with bishop d3, as we saw before, white can play other moves. One of them is knight f3. And this setup. So you don't see it a lot, but it makes sense for white. It's actually very dynamic because white is ready to sacrifice a pawn in many different ways here. And the knight is not, the knight is more active on f3, but it can also be attacked easily. And white cannot play f4, so it's just another line. I think if black plays queen b6 here, I think it more or less wins this pawn by force. Knight b3, then c4. So white castles here, and then if black takes this pawn on d4, is very dangerous. But so that's another line. White gets a lot of compensation for that pawn active play. But bishop e7. I've also played that in some of my games. And then this idea of playing g5, which is very logical because we're trying to kick that knight out to weaken the center. So basically white has to take here. And then this is one of the positions. And now the c5 pawn is hanging. So let's say knight b3. There are other options as well, but this is just one of the most played lines. And here they also played different moves. But black is probably going to move this knight soon. So I looked at a move like h5, which guards this pawn on g4, and then we can move our knight to g6. Let's say rook e1, knight g6. Let's say knight takes. And bishop d3. And castles, and then bishop h6. And here I looked at the move, which is also a novelty. I simply look at this move f5, which is a little bit of a provocation. And then, yeah, if white doesn't take the rook, then I just play rook f7. My point being that after bishop h6, I don't really want my rook here on e8. So I want it on the f file. So white takes, and then queen takes f8. So what would be the compensation for black in a position like this? So this is very typical French, and also why I got the idea. Because we have our typical double-edged bishop, which is our goalkeeper. So it just keeps everything defended. And luckily for us, we still have a lot of pieces we can attack with. We have an additional rook. So the position is also fairly closed because of all these pawns. So there are no real open lines for the white rooks. So white has a double pawn here. c5 might be weak. At least it's tying down the knight to this pawn. And the majority white has over here is not so easy to move forward. And black has all kinds of idea to expand or maybe jump the knight into the position. They also move like bishop f6, queen g7, bringing the rook over. So this is quite an easy position to play for black. So good central control, the dark squared bishop, we have the bishop pair, and quite an easy position for black to play, I would say. So this is interesting, and this is one of those positions that's about 0.50, half a pawn for white, but it's definitely, I think it's compensation for black. So, so I haven't played this yet in a game, but it's definitely an idea. And it's not such a crazy idea. If you see other French line and you know a little bit about the French defense, then exchange sacrifices like these are quite typical. Okay. Let's jump ahead and see a couple of middle game positions. So here it's white to move, and white has an overwhelming position. We can just start from this point. Now white played bishop a3. So this bishop finally comes into play. I believe it's the first time it moved in the game. And white has all this space in the position. And this rook is very active. There are weaknesses like here. We got our knight all the way to a6. So this looks great for white, but there is no immediate breakthrough. But because white has all this space and has an active position, then you start to think about ways to break through here. So black cannot do a lot. This is what happened in the game. Queen g3, putting pressure on g7. The bishop goes to d6. Queen to d3. Queen b7. I believe that if black is greedy and takes this pawn, at least we can win the queen if we want. Maybe there's even a better move, not sure, but we can at least win the queen if we want. But there might also be a move like rook c6 followed by queen to the c file. This looks pretty good for white. So black didn't want to do that. So he moved the queen back to b7. And now white took on c4. So why is this a strong exchange sacrifice? What is white gaining out of this? Why is it so strong? That's my first question today. But let's try to consider why this is a very strong exchange sacrifice. So a good thing is always to look at weaknesses, targets. So only own pawn weaknesses, but also the opponent. That's a good way to be concrete about the position. Yeah, the e6 pawn is weak, get a lot of pressure there. So looking at concrete targets. So we might have this idea when we sacrifice an exchange that, oh no, all the pieces are going to be exchanged and then we're going to lose the endgame bishop versus rook. So that's always a danger, of course, but it's not a very it's not very clear thinking. So it's better to be more concrete about it and then look at the concrete targets like e6, maybe g7. So actual weaknesses in the position. And then when you start to realize, oh, I don't have so many weaknesses I need to take care of, and it's not so easy for my opponent to exchange pieces off, get into that endgame scenario, then you might see that this is a very strong option. So being concrete about targets and actual points of attack is a very good way to get rid of these ghosts of being afraid of sacrificing the exchange. Sometimes it's just the best option. So yeah, especially e6 is going to be the weak point here. So okay, and we could also argue black's rooks are not really doing a lot. White's pieces are active. White's weaknesses, I don't know, hard to get at, not so relevant. D4 maybe, but the bishop is blocking the D file. H5, maybe not so relevant. So there are not a lot of weaknesses White has to worry about. So that means White has a lot of freedom to think forward, to think about how to attack. And the black king is a little bit open, exposed. So it needs pieces around it for defense. So let's see how this ended. So black is trying the only counterplay he has, f4, f3. Maybe trying to get the rook out. Maybe, yeah, black has to try something. I guess if we play a move like queen d7, now we could totally lock black down by playing f4. It's one idea, but maybe we can also just break through with d5. I get a suggestion here. That's interesting. Knight b8. It's not your everyday move, but it does kick the queen away from the e6 pawn. So this looks pretty great. And now we can just take that pawn on e6. That's a very interesting idea. Maybe we can even relocate it later to c6. So knight b8 looks strong. Yeah. So this is just horrible for black. So that was a great idea. F4 and then F3. So black is really trying hard. But now the bishop is attacked and black's pieces have to go passive and white simply takes here. So yeah, maybe there's some ideas with queen c1, queen g5 check. So white simply steps out of this, queen king g2, and black resigned. So that was really nothing to come for, but that run with the f pawn was a little bit desperate. But what else could black do? So okay, let's move on. So here's one last example. So I was black in this position, and my opponent has just played knight to f5 to try to stop my bishop pair. So black to move and win. So it all starts with rook takes f5. So take a few minutes and see if you can calculate to the end of the game. And when you have an idea, you can just put it in the chat, as always. Yeah. So Matt, that's correct. That's basically what he tried. So that's basically the idea. Yeah, rook takes and then bishop takes. And then if king f1, we simply have bishop e3 here. So in the game, he tried to play e6. And then bishop e3 is better than bishop a3. We keep the knight pinned. So this is just what happened. And then I just stopped that pawn with the king, and then he resigned at this point. So I'm going to win the rook for that pawn. So so that was just a position to finish us off. Let's end here. And do you have any final questions? Otherwise, we will just go offline and get back at 8:30 to go through the 8 puzzles. Okay, so so we end the presentation now and see you back at 8:30.